From paying a very small percentage of the total revenue to fighters, to not taking care of the retired legends. Here's the real reason the UFC doesn't care about its fighters. It's a tale as old as time, and it extends to whichever sport you love. The athletes are never happy with how they're being compensated, and they think they deserve more. But when we talk about the biggest MMA organization in the world, I'd say the fighters have earned the right to complain. Just to paint a picture, the UFC shares less than 14% of its revenue with the fighters, and compared to boxing, NBA, or any other major sports league, it's incredibly low. You can argue that it's all part of business, and maybe the revenue generated is so high, the fighters can be accommodated with a very low percentage of share. But let me tell you, that's definitely not the case. There are countless examples of fighters struggling to make ends meet and having to work full-time while being a professional athlete, which is definitely not any kid's dream growing up. When most fighters make it to the octagon, the starting contract is about 10 to 30 grand, and that's on a show-win basis. That means if you lose your fight, you only get half the money. And when you're in a sport as tough as MMA, and there are so many variables that you can't control, it's hard to bet on yourself to win and get the full paycheck. And this show-win model extends all the way to the top, so you're not guaranteed a full paycheck unless you win the fight. And no matter how good you are, there's only a 50% chance of that happening. So the consequence of losing is brutal. The UFC has an obligation to offer 3 fights to each fighter in a calendar year. And for most athletes on the roster, getting paid 3 times a year is the only way they can survive. That is, unless you get injured, and in that case, you're on your own. But why is the UFC's compensation for its fighters not enough? I mean, if you get paid 30 grand 3 times a year, you could live pretty decently without having to take another job. But the problem is, most fighters have to spend an enormous amount of money training for their fights. Running a camp takes up a big chunk of your pay, and after you've paid your coaches, training partners, management, and nutritionist, you're left with half of your income. And that's why it's so important to get that W. I didn't even mention all the other variables that could damage the fighters' livelihoods. Let's say the bout falls off because the opponent's injured. Guess what? You're not getting paid a dime, and they're not obligated to offer an alternative opponent. All they have to do is offer a fight 3 times a year, which sounds unfair. Not to mention all the times the judges screw up a fight and give the decision to the wrong person. And no matter how many times Dana White says don't leave it in the hands of the judges, it's practically impossible to guarantee a finish. To make things worse, even the bonus money hasn't increased in decades. One good thing the UFC does is reward its fighters for finishing the fight, but there's a chance you won't get a bonus, even after you do everything they ask. There's also a Fight of the Night award for the 2 athletes who have the most exciting fight. But what happens if 2 fighters tear each other apart limb from limb and still don't get the Fight of the Night? Nada. The biggest problem, though, is how much bonus money is given. The Performance of the Night bonus has been 50 grand from the start, which was a pretty generous sum at the time, but since then the company's worth has gone into billions. And MMA has become one of the most popular sports on the planet. But despite all that, the bonus money hasn't gone above 50 Gs. It may not sound like a big deal, but after more than 2 decades and a huge growth in the world of combat sports, the least they can do is give a bigger bonus to their athletes. And it's not like the fighters have other sources of making money when they get in the cage, because after the Reebok deal, you can't have any sponsors on your shorts. In 2015, the UFC's deal with Reebok was introduced, and there was a lot of protest from the fighters, because this meant that the old days of fighters wearing whatever they want inside the cage were over. Dana was excited to make MMA look like a major sport in America. And if you look at the NFL, NBA, or MLB, they all have uniforms. To quote the UFC president, it looks more professional. But the only thing that UFC did with that decision was take away the element of authenticity away from the fighters. Because before the deal, each fighter had their preferred style of dressing up. Now they gotta wear UFC-approved clothes throughout fight week, even when they do interviews. But that wasn't the main problem. Before signing with Reebok, fighters were allowed to put sponsors on their shorts to make extra money, but since then, only the Reebok-approved shorts can be worn, and fighters don't get compensated nearly as much. You don't want to pay them, and you don't let them make their own money. Doesn't look like the fighters' needs are valued over here. In 2021, The Reebok deal ran out and the UFC signed with Venom. The same rules apply now, but the pay increase is almost insignificant. I could understand all this if the fighters got a bigger chunk of the sponsorships and the scrutiny wasn't so strict. Take the example of Dustin Poirier after he beat Michael Chandler at MSG. The former interim champ wanted to wear Marvin Hagler's war hat at the post-fight press conference, but it had to be taped up and hidden, so it didn't look like a piece of clothing that didn't belong to Venom. A bit too extreme for a hat. Of course, if things are so bad, why don't the fighters jump ship? The problem is, with the contract stipulations by the UFC, you can't do that either. They didn't become the biggest MMA promotion on the planet for no reason. Every time a fighter gets signed to the UFC, they have to sign an 8-fight contract. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But the contract is completely one-sided, which means you can't leave the company unless you've fought at least 8 times. On the flip side, if you lose a fight or if the UFC wants to remove you from the roster for whatever reasons, they have the right to do that. The fighters are also not allowed to compete in other sports, or even have exhibition matches in boxing or kickboxing. Unless, of course, your name is Conor McGregor, and in that case, the UFC would co-promote, so they could get some of the money too. Another big issue with the 8-fight deal is that you gotta wait till the contract's up before you can ask for a pay increase. So many fighters like Sean O'Malley avoid fighting higher-ranked opponents until they get paid accordingly. The UFC has also made some dirty moves in the past to restrict the fighters from leaving the company, like the time when Nate Diaz wanted to turn down a new contract and leave the UFC. They made him wait more than a year and finally matched him up with Khamzat freaking Chimaev, so he had an unwinnable fight on his way out. I guess we should thank the MMA gods for letting that fight fall apart and giving Nate the submission win over Tony instead. That being said, if the UFC wants to look like a major sports league, there should be some kind of pension for fighters to retire. We see it all the time. The legends don't retire until after their time, and the biggest reason for that is they usually don't have enough savings to call it a career and retire. If there was a pension for the UFC veterans or even just the Hall of Famers, we wouldn't have our heroes taking more damage than they should. Remember Chuck Liddell? The light heavyweight champ was asked to retire by the UFC and was promised a pension for all his years of service. But when the UFC changed ownership in 2016, that deal was over, and Liddell had to compete in a trilogy against Tito Ortiz, which he lost brutally. We also wouldn't have had to lose UFC Hall of Famer Stephan Bonnar to substance abuse, if the UFC had helped out one of its pioneers. So there you have it, MMA fans. From not taking care of the retired legends to paying a very small percentage of the total revenue to fighters, that was the real reason why the UFC doesn't care about fighters.